This is a 2011 Jeep Grand Cherokee, and the engine mount went out on it, driver's side. The passenger side, it's over here on the, obviously that one's not going to be any big problem. You don't need any special tools really to get to that. Just a 15 millimeter socket and a wrench, and you're going to be in a 10 millimeter for the heat shield, and you're going to be good to go. So probably the first thing I'd recommend is, depending on if you've wrenched on engines or not, this might be a project as we go through this, you may decide just to take it to a mechanic to do. However, if you want to proceed with it, this is what you're going to need. Over here, you're going to need at least a 13 millimeter box wrench, 10 millimeter, 8 millimeter. This 15 millimeter you're going to definitely need with this ratchet on the end. You're going to need a 4-inch extender. You're going to need a 15 millimeter socket, and if you do not already have a air ratchet, this is going to be a project that will justify buying an air ratchet. This I got at Home Depot for, I think it was $84 or something like that. The other tool that you might need, and we'll get to this later, is this little hooter here. You may or may not need this, but like I said, I'll come back to this in just a moment. The engine mounts themselves, this is the one I took off. What happens is they'll start leaking down here, and you'll end up with, essentially, it looks like dirty oil or something. It's a brown oil, and it'll end up spotting out on your driveway or your garage where you park your car. I don't know that it's really critical that day. You could probably still drive it, but obviously once that starts happening, you want to begin making immediately arrangements. You start wearing out your engine mount, and the engine will start lurching, and you can cause a lot of other damage. These are roughly, this is September 2018, this is about $67 from the dealership. And these actually, whether it's the left or right, they're the same. On this particular model that I have, these will work. Important is that this, and we'll talk about more of this later when we get the installation, this will be facing out. The problem that you're going to come into here is when you lift the engine, the bracket, I'll turn this a little bit sideways, the engine bracket for the mount never clears it, and you simply will not be able to get this out just by lifting up the engine. You'll actually have to remove the plenum. This needs to be right about here, flush at the minimum. Your bracket, if this was your bracket's going to need to be flush with the top of the stud for this to come out, and even then it's a little bit of a booger. Okay, so on to the funness here. You're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then there's also one back here. There's 7 8 millimeters that are going to have to be removed, if you can see that. But this bracket right here that's holding on the plenum will have to be removed, and the other one is, you kind of see right there where I've been working on it. That's a 13 millimeter. Where I've been working on that to get that bracket off. I'm actually going to replace that with a spacer so that the nut comes in on the other side. What they did on the other side, just to make it even more fun, was they put one of those little spline nuts on there where essentially it won't come off. You can't unbolt, you can't put a ratchet on it to get it off. You essentially have to cut it off or something like that. But I'm going to put a spacer on there. Reason for that is because in the infinite design of this intelligent engine, apparently the engine mounts that I've read go from 50 to 60,000 miles. I've been wrenching on cars for 50 years, and I've never had to replace an engine mount, although probably they needed to by that time. Evidently this vehicle on these engine mounts, 50 to 60,000 miles is in that space. So what I'm doing is I'm going to start investing in a little bit of time, particularly on this one, and we'll get to over here in just a moment on this other side of the plenum, to make this a little bit easier for me. On this side, if we can get the light on that, you can see right there I mooned that one out, and I don't know that you'll be able to see it. Just for additional fun, they put the other 8 millimeter way back there. You will be able to get to it. What I did was I went ahead and used that little hooter there, that little Dremel cutter, and it just zipped through this to moon this out, and then after a while I just went ahead and cut it to get rid of it, and I'll end up replacing that with an 8 millimeter stud and putting that back in there together to hold that in. I don't know that that's totally critical. All right, so here's an important note to take. And the reason why we're doing this, by the way, I should have started with this at the beginning. As you jack up the engine, the plenum will not clear. It'll start hitting up on the back of your engine wall. And what that causes is over here, there, I believe, if you look down there, that bracket, see how much of the stud is showing on that bracket? So the only way I could get this engine to come up high enough to get the engine bracket and mount disconnected to where it'd swivel out of there is to remove the plenum, so that when you jacked it up, that bracket's at least flush with the top of that stud. Like I said, now back to the plenum. So that's why we're removing the plenum, is that there's not enough space for the engine to come up high enough to clear the bracket over here. So once you've done these bolts, notice how these 8mm are sticking up. You want to make important to make sure that, go ahead and raise this up and look underneath there. Sure that none of these screws have fallen down, and as you take this out, it's dragging across the top of that manifold. You do not want to booger that up. You're not damaged anything. Well, you may damage it, but I'm saying it's a replaceable item, but there's no sense in damaging any more parts than you need to on this. To the gaskets, I'm going to go ahead and replace the gaskets because this screw actually did drag across one of them, and I do not want to go through this fun again. So I'm going to go ahead and replace those gaskets. They're about $28 at AutoZone. So just, that's real critical. Once you do that, this plenum with that back 8mm off, it'll just slide out of here, and that's why I went ahead and mooned that bracket over there on that 8mm so that I could just pull it out. At this point I was, all right, next job is once you have these brackets, and we'll talk about the hidden ledge over here. That turned out to be pretty interesting. But anyway, so now on to the engine. You're going to remove, that's what it looks like. It's this engine shroud that goes down here. You're going to, jacking up the engine, you're going to place this right on the oil pan. Now, like I said, what happens is the engine comes up, it actually cants over to the driver's side, and I think that's why it won't clear that bracket over here. There could be other options, so I went ahead and went with removing the plenum. But anyway, that's going to be step one, jack it up. Once you remove this, you'll actually have direct access, and this is where you're going to need that air wrench. On that bolt right there, if I get the light on this right, a little difficult here holding the light at the same time and doing all this, but anyway, you get the idea. That bracket under there, that's your first bolt that you'll take off. You can get to the other one right there, and then you're going to need to come in from the other angle to reach up to get this one. And likewise on this side, you see that starter right there, the other bracket bolt is right above that. I recommend disconnecting the battery. If you were real good at that old board game Doctor, you'll probably be just fine. Once you do that, you'll notice in that space, and I'm going to do the best I can to try to describe what's going to happen here. But so you've got your bracket, right? And imagine the brackets on top. Once you get these two, and these are two 15mm, it's a 15mm on the top, obviously, that you want to get that off. And you're going to have to do all this from underneath. You will not be able to get to these bolts from the top. So once you have removed these two 15mm, and this is jacked up, and the bracket's at least flush with the top of this, as you push up on this, you're going to flip it to the side. You're also going to want to disconnect the heater hose. There's a bolt and a nut that'll disconnect the heater hose, and that's this pipe you see going across right here. So I've gone ahead and I've loosened that up. That'll help you out a little bit. But what's going to happen is once it's in there, you're going to have to tilt it this way, sideways, and that heater hose, at this point the bracket's going to be going horizontal against that heater hose. At that point you'll be able to pull the bracket out, and then you'll be able to pull the engine mount, replace the engine mount. Now for reassembly, what's going to happen is, because it's so high, you've got two options. I went with the option I'm going to tell you. You might want to slowly lower the engine just a little bit, but I went with this option. Go ahead and put in the bolts for the bracket. here, put this one in and put this one in over here, and then go ahead and put your bracket on top of this loosely. Make sure, again, this is facing out towards the out, facing, it's going to be facing like this. This is going to be facing out away from the engine, because that bracket's going to set on there. It's got a little hooter that sits in there, or catches in that little pin, and that's how that sits in there. So once you get in there, this is going to be down. Now you're probably going to have to press down with one hand to get this down, because that bracket's going to want to have a tendency to twist this just a little bit. Like I said, if you want to take that chance and lower it down, I probably could have done that, but I just press this down, put these bolts in to get them started. Then on the bracket, I went ahead and got the bolts started up on the bracket, okay, on the bottom two. I just did the bottom two to get them started, and then made sure before you lower, and on the top one, I did three rather, let me back up, I did three. To make sure, now make sure before you lower this, that this bracket as you start to come down is centered up in here. So just do a visual check from this side, and as you start to lower it on the passenger side, the bracket will actually be above it. So just make sure as you're lowering your engine down very slowly, do multiple checks to make sure that that bracket is lined up and coming down. Once you get down to approximately right around in this area, so go ahead and tighten this up here, because the reason is once it's under there, it's got that twist. You see those little thingy things here? There's a slot for these to go in. If you don't do that, this won't be in those slots, right? So that's why I'm saying that's why that's important, is you want to get these little thingy things in the slots there. Put this down, press it down, get this started, get the bracket started, and then you can go ahead and lower the engine enough, and at that point then you ought to bolt on and you're going to be good to go, and that's where you're going to be at approximately right about now as well. Added footage, all right. Once you're over here, 13 millimeter bracket on the plenum, oops, that 13 millimeter bracket on the plenum over here, it looks like it's a little bit out of focus, so apologize for all this if it's, I don't have high def equipment here to work with, but anyway, once you're doing that, you drop your wrench about 1 in 5 times. That wrench is going to take the Chrysler water slide. All right, every engine has those invisible ledges that you will hunt to go find that nut. Most of these on this Chrysler are pretty easy to find. On one drop, what will happen is the wrench between the frame and the firewall, it'll catch there. It won't ever hit the ground. The doozy is it will run from here up right above your exhaust manifold, okay? It'll slide and come all the way down along your exhaust, and I kid you not, it will then jump over, and if you'll see this, oh, and I forgot to tell you, you also want to loosen up, there's 2 transmission engine mount bolts that you want to loosen up before you start raising your engine. Make sure those 2 bolts, if you can see them right there, there's 2 transmission mount bolts. Those are 15 mil, I think, as well, or yeah, 15 mil, and you want those loosened. But it will slide down, that wrench will slide down, and it'll jump over into that pan, and that pan is ridged, and so a 13 millimeter, once it catches on the inside of one of those, it'll lie flat, and if you're looking at it from this direction, you will not see it. So if you have a wrench that you drop and it never hits the ground and you can't find it directly under the engine, I suggest coming over here to find it. And I don't know if my guardian angel has a sense of humor that day. I do not know. I did not find it funny. It took me 2 days to find that wrench. Hopefully this is going to be helpful for replacing the driver's side engine mount. These 8 millimeters, as you're running this out of here, these things will absolutely, right there, those are little 8 millimeters. You put some tape on that or something, because when this is sitting down there on top of the engine and you go wrenching on this, those things will absolutely rip you apart. So put some tape on that. That's probably the biggest frustration of this, is some of the access and some of the design. They just made it extremely difficult, and keeping in mind that these are items that evidently have a 50 to 60,000 life. So if you're buying a used one, keep that in mind. Depending on the mileage of that car, you can expect your engine mounts. And one way that you can tell is, you'll notice, I'm going to go back, You'll press down on that. If it's bad, oil will come spurting out of there. So don't get your eyeball right underneath it. But if you're buying a used one, you absolutely need to check, especially if it's got 50,000 miles on it or more. You absolutely need to check that to make sure that those engine mounts are bad. Hope that helps. Wish you the best on this project. Like I said, it is doable. Also, by the way, there's also you probably want to go ahead and buy the service manual from the dealership. Those are about $230. The reason why I'm going to a little bit more effort on this plenum to make sure it's easily removable is look at where the spark plugs are. These spark plugs are sitting underneath this side of the plenum. That's the same as on the Chrysler 300. I had a 2006 and I've got a 2013-14, and it's the same thing. I really don't like these plenums. I don't understand why you've got all this space over here on the right-hand side for the plenum. I'm sure there's a logical reason that it comes in from the back, it swirls around, but you know, I sure like the 4-barrel carburetors where if you had to get to something, it was right there. This thing is really just a pain in the behootie to work around. But anyway, this has to be removed to be able to change out your spark plugs, which in another 50,000 miles you'll have to do that as well. All right, like I said, hopefully this helps. It's kind of